welcome to today's webinar. I'm going to let people continue to kind of trickle in. We had over 400 people register for today's webinar, which is really exciting. And I'm assuming a lot of you are going to be watching this after the fact. So hello in the future if you're watching this later. So we still have some folks trickling in. Awesome. Well, again, welcome to today's webinar, Behind the Scenes, the Washington Post TikTok team, which I have been so excited about. We're going to look at, what it takes to create those funny, entertaining videos while also still maintaining those standards of quality journalism. So as we get started, please feel free to let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. And just a couple of things to note before we really dive in. This is a webinar format, so unfortunately, we won't be able to see you or have you unmute yourself. However, we are going to try to get through as many questions as we can, so please use that Q&A button. We also have a handout to go along with today's webinar for teachers if you would like your students to be using that. We're going to drop that in the chat for you. And I also want to say a happy National News Literacy Week. This is a time when we shine a spotlight on local news, its role in a healthy democracy, and also the importance of news and media literacy education. But I am extremely excited to welcome Dave Jorgensen and Carmela Boykin. Dave launched the Washington Post TikTok in 2019, and while his title on the Washington Post website is Senior Video Reporter, he's probably more affectionately known as the Washington Post TikTok guy. And now you're a new dad as well, so congratulations on that. I do have to say though, Dave, every video since your return from paternity leave, I'm very surprised that you haven't been rocking the dad uniform of long denim jorts and tube socks.
I'm wearing it underneath those clothes, but yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. I have my mug at least, so that counts for something.
Nice.
But, yeah.
And Carmela is also the face of the TikTok account. Speaking of face, we were just saying right before we logged on that Carmela, you have the best facial expressions when delivering news, and that I had such a fun time kind of selecting screenshots for these first few slides. But Carmela joined the Post in 2022, and before that, she also worked as a local TV news reporter. So I want to say welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. But before we fully dive in, we thought it'd be fun to kick things off with a very quick poll to hear from you guys on how you're using TikTok. So I know teachers, you may be kind of watching this as a classroom, so maybe just do a quick kind of show of hands. But how are you using TikTok the most? Is it for news, entertainment, style, beauty, shopping, or using it as a creative outlet? Dave, Carmelo, while we wait for those polls to come in, I would love to also hear from you guys when you're not creating news. How are you spending your time on TikTok?
I was really mad I couldn't vote. I can't vote in the poll as a host or whatever. I actually would have picked creative outlet for me personally, just because everything, by the end of the day, I'm like, that's enough news for me. So yeah, I definitely use it that way. What about you, Carmela?
Yeah, I definitely, because news is my employment, I definitely use it for entertainment on a burner account that I just watch things completely unrelated to the news cycle.
I love that. Well, it seems like entertainment was the overall majority, which makes sense since TikTok is an entertainment platform. But now let's really dive in. So we circulated a Google form for questions ahead of today's event, and one of the most asked questions was, How does the Washington Post decide on the best way to deliver news on the platform? So Dave and Carmela, I know you have some examples you want to share. So can you start us off by just walking us through your typical process?
Yes. So I will, well, I'll just start with doing that before I do a little screen share here. We actually are going to get into our process quite a bit here, but especially with Carmela, she's going to go through the approval aspect, but a lot of that has to do with how the team began, because what I always say when we have like a new member to the team is like, this job was made up less than 5 years ago. So anything you ask or any questions you have are not dumb, because we don't even, we're just kind of making this up as we go. Not unlike, just the idea of being a YouTube creator, for instance. That's a relatively recent thing where a lot of people probably even watching have filled out a survey where they say, hey, I want to be a YouTube creator when I grow up. I think our job as sort of TikTok news creators is even more new and totally, again, made up, but in the best way possible. So actually, I'll just start with sharing the screen so we can kind of get into all of that, because to understand how we got here, we have to start at the beginning a little bit. So this is the team that we have. I am the guy in the middle pretending to be, I think, Biden. I don't remember what TikTok that was, but Carmela made a lot of cool GIFs that we have from our Washington Post GIF account. Carmela, go ahead, introduce yourself fully.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm Carmela. Like Alexa said, I joined the team in December of 2021. This will age me, but I graduated college in May of 2021, and my first job was working in local news in Rochester, New York. So I saw someone in the chat from Ithaca, so shout out upstate New York. And I worked there for a very brief period. It was like 6 months or so. And I knew I always wanted to work on like a more entertaining side of news and be able to be a little more light. So I applied to this job and got it. Have been working here since December 2021 and have just been having a good time.
I can't believe you just said the phrase, "this will age me." I'll go a step further. So I've been in the sort of news business, so to speak, for over a decade now, and I've been at the Post now for about 6.5 years. The Washington Post, where we are employed. Though some people, and I'll get to that later, didn't know initially what the Washington Post was when we started going on TikTok. But for the first 2 or 3 years at the Post, I was making videos on a YouTube channel. They were long, well-produced, 4 to 6 minute videos. And the idea was to reach a younger audience. But we realized, I'd spend weeks on one thing and I'd get like 300 views. And that was disappointing. It was nice to be getting paid, but it was also like, man, I really want to get some reach here. And so when I found out about TikTok in late 2018, I thought this could be an interesting platform to use. And I pitched it to all the people that mattered at the Post early on in 2019. And it was kind of the perfect time to pitch it, because they trusted me enough because I'd been there, but they also didn't even know what TikTok was yet. And so that kind of worked in our favor. There's a lot of ask for forgiveness later. But now we have a whole team. As you see, Carmela, I'm the middle. And then Joseph, we just added last week, and he's already making a huge impact on our team. So I want to just give you an example of a video that we have. This is a recent video. This is from last week. And it's got a lot going on. So we're just going to play the video first.
Hello, I would like to purchase this with my debit card. And so you shall. Enjoy your purchase. I will. Thank you. Ah, the city. You have insufficient funds. Your balance is now -6 cents. An overdraft fee of $26 will be charged to your account. $26?
Did you see that? That man on the street just got charged $26 for going 6 cents over on his account.
Yeah, he's part of more than a quarter of Americans who have faced overdraft fees or other similar charges in the past year.
My goodness.
You remember in 2022 when Wells Fargo was charging customers even when they had sufficient funds?
Oh, yes.
And Bank of America was imposing multiple overdraft fees on a single transaction.
I propose we cap the overdraft charges somewhere between $3 and $14.
Hear, hear.
What do you think of that, world?
We strongly oppose this and really any federal regulation.
Well, let's wait and see what the public thinks.
When will this be enacted?
We're still working on the details. For now, it's just a proposal. Enjoy your purchase.
I will.
Okay, so a lot to unpack in one video there. We'll start with the spam. Early on in 2019, I started making TikToks where I would just like eat spam and reference spam, and I just did it as a joke. And then it became this long running thing where by the time we got into the pandemic, I created this, well, I didn't create, he was born, Sam. He's a real living thing, entity. And Sam was featured in a lot of early TikToks in 2020. We'd basically been on TikTok for about 9 months at that point. And so we were established, but then it became this whole thing where I could create a TikTok every day. And that's when it became my full-time job, when TikTok became popular for everyone else. The best way to put it is when we got on TikTok, it was mostly 14, 15, 16-year-olds that were watching our content. And then by 2020, all of a sudden, everyone that I knew was watching. They're like, oh, this is what you've been up to for the last year. And so suddenly we had a much larger demographic, and that was really exciting. And we could really lean into it because initially, as I mentioned earlier, not a lot of people knew what the Washington Post was. They thought my name was Washington, that I was posting. They had no idea. And we were just trying to go along with it. So now we're at this point where 5 years later, we're making these long, sometimes 60 seconds, if not more, TikToks that are much more intricate, like this one right here. I chose this one because there's a lot going on in it, but I think that sometimes is our strong point in that people have to kind of rewatch it to understand all the points, because we basically have stuffed as much as we can of an article into this video. And there's a lot of things happening. And Carmela, when she shows her TikTok here, is going to go into a lot of the production of this, but there's a lot of her own TikTok, but there's a lot of production that happens where we have a lot of scene changes. There's a lot of green screen. There's a lot of different inside jokes with the spam and everything. And it's all designed for people to watch it a lot, learn a lot, and also feel like they're part of our larger community, or as we call it, the Washington Post TikTok cinematic universe, or just Washington Post universe, which now includes not just TikTok, but we also post on YouTube Shorts and Reels, as vertical video has become something that not only is important to our team, but really everyone in news, because they kind of realized that's where people are. So
Hello, I would like to.
We don't have to watch it again. I mean, we can, but so just to give you an idea of this video, this type of headline to me, even now, but like especially when I was younger, was like, I'm not going to read this. It's too much. I see the phrase economic policy and I go, I don't know. But what's exciting for me about my day-to-day job, our day-to-day job, is that we get to take something like this and try to make it interesting, try to make it exciting for people. And that to me is such a fun challenge to try to overcome every day. And we do often post to TikTok 5 days a week, each of us. So there is like every day, it's just a new challenge. You wake up, you try to make something, you post it, you hope it does well. Hopefully it does. If it doesn't, whatever, next day you just start over again. And that's really exciting. And it's fun to take something like this that is sort of a lot going on in one story, but also really relevant to people. And that's something where we've noticed in the last couple of years that people started to use TikTok, there goes my light, as something where you can search. So a lot of people might have seen an article about overdraft fees. They're like, oh, that's a lot, but they can go search overdraft fees on TikTok and then find our TikTok and learn a lot about it. So I mentioned that we're on a lot of platforms. The one on the left here is TikTok, and that did pretty well there. And on the right, we reposted the video to YouTube Shorts. And we have found lately that really any platform at any given time seems to work very differently for any video. We don't necessarily know why, but it's actually worked to be posting across different platforms, especially Shorts. So we do have a lot of interesting ways to try to repost it, but essentially it's the same video. So some takeaways from that: it was relevant info to the audience. A lot of our audience is Gen Z and millennials. If they're anything like me, any indication, then financially they might have been doing a lot what I was doing in my 20s, which is overdrafting. So I thought this is relevant to that audience. It's searchable. It can work across different platforms. And like I said, there's a lot of different scene changes in a TikTok. As silly as it sounds, I don't think it's necessarily like an ADD thing, as a lot of people would say, but I do think it helps if a video has a lot of things going on, a lot of action, a lot of music and things going on to keep people interested. And now I will hand it over to Carmela.
Thank you, Dave. Alexa, one of the questions you had on your slides at the beginning was, how do you cover stories? And I think with each story, there's always a different kind of approach you can take. So this story happened on Tuesday, October 3rd, 2023. So it was Mean Girls Day that Kevin McCarthy was voted out as House Speaker. And I think Dave is in charge of the slides, and I think he may have disappeared. Thank you. So this TikTok format I decided to go with was like the lip sync format. It's one of my favorites because honestly, I just like lip syncing in my real life. So I've incorporated it into my work, which is kind of fun. So if you go to the next slide, I can break down how it came together. A common question that I get, or that we get, is how long do TikToks take? I started this TikTok at 4:47 p.m. It published at 8:39 p.m., which is like about 4 hours of a turnover. So now I'll break down like the different parts that came into place. The story first started, or I first learned about the story at 4:47 p.m. Next slide, please. Thank you. When a person from the team posted that like the news broke that Kevin McCarthy is out. And okay, I was the only person on staff this day. Dave was on paternity leave. We still had like a vacant spot. And so I had to decide, I can end my work shift now and cover the story tomorrow, or I can just like work tonight, get the story out, and then the next day I can work on something else. So I decided to work into the night. Next slide, please. So at 5:10, I kind of knew, I committed that, okay, I'm going to work through the night. Next slide, please. That I'm going to like make something happen. And then by 5:16, I decided Get Out by JoJo is kind of a perfect song for this because effectively that's what Congress told Kevin McCarthy to do. So I will sing and I'll make it work. So then once I had the idea, this was a style of getting approval where whenever we have text bubbles on screen on TikTok, our managers, of course, want to know what that final TikTok is going to look like. So in Premiere, we put in temporary text bubbles. So this is just an example of a script of what I sent my managers saying, hey, this is what the text is going to look like. I'll, of course, sing in the background, but can you approve these different pieces of text? So this is all done in Premiere. It's quite anticlimactic. It's just a black screen. And my managers can kind of infer what faces are going to come, but they don't know until, of course, the final TikTok is done. Then credit to my managers, they approved the script so quickly. I like sent it to them, and within 15 minutes, they were in a live show themselves, like talking about Kevin McCarthy. And so like in the control room, they were working on their jobs as well. And they were playing JoJo Get Out while a live show was happening, and they approved my scripts. So this is what my Premiere timeline looks like, basically. So all of the pinkish text you see in the center, that's all the temporary text that I put in. When we publish this TikTok, all that text gets deleted, and I go in with my manual fingers and like put in the TikTok text. But again, this is just placeholders. Then the green that you see, those are all the different variations of myself singing and dancing that you saw at the beginning. And then at the bottom, that's the sound. So I edit the sound in Premiere, so I have control over the volume and it's not too much, and I can mess around with it as I like. So I sent it for approval at 8:07 with a temporary text. Again, it got approved at 8:16. And I published it at 8:39. It does take a significant amount of time to go in the TikTok app and put in all of the temporary text or put in the real text. But by using the text that TikTok provides instead of our Premiere Pro text, it makes our content look native to the platform, and it tends to do better that way. So that's why I made it.
Thank you, Carmela. And now the group talk. So we, when we're all in a TikTok together or any combination of us, we call it a group talk, obviously. One thing that happened early on when Carmela started and Chris, our former teammate, started, though we still love Chris. It always sounds like he's like long gone. He's okay. He's out there working on Marshall Project. Anyway, so when we first started, we were all still remote because of COVID. And so we did a lot of stuff with green screen, which we still do to this day. In fact, I think it's kind of a carryover that green screen became necessary during the pandemic. And then it was like, oh, this is actually a really fun way to create things. Anyway, when that first started, we didn't know each other's height. So if you look at those early TikToks, Carmela, Chris, and I are all the same height. But then as soon as we're in the office, you realize, oh, they're varying heights of different people. So that was something that was fun early on trying to figure out. But once we figured that out, it got even better with the green screens. And we're able to recreate a lot of events. This is an example of a TikTok that's just using audio that was otherwise just published to an article. This is just audio that leaked of former President Trump talking about classified documents. It's audio that is being used in a lot of cases right now that he's being charged for. And what's kind of fun about this is like, okay, we can take this audio and we're not changing anything. We're not manipulating it at all. We're just taking the audio and trying to recreate it. It's something that they do a lot in the show that I used to love growing up called Drunk History, which might still be around. I don't know, but it's basically just lip syncing to this audio, which is also inherent to TikTok. When TikTok first started, lip syncing was like the thing to do. So it's fun that it's kind of native to the app, but it's also news at the same time. In this case, we could use a bunch of different characters, a bunch of different people to just act out the different parts that were on this tape.
All sorts of stuff. It's pages long. Look. Wait a minute. Let's see here.
Yeah.
I just found. Isn't that amazing? This totally wins my case, you know. Except it is like highly confidential, secret. This is secret information. See, as president, I could have did less about it. Now I can't, you know. But this is classic.
Now we have a problem.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's so cool. I mean, it's so. Look, we here and I have. And you probably almost didn't believe me, but now you believe me.
No, I believe
It's
you.
incredible, right?
No,
Hey, bring some Cokes in, please.
My favorite part of that was scripting it and then saying, Carmela here, just react to these different clips, and just seeing every take was a different facial expression. And I had a really fun thing. I remember picking from like 4. I mean, like, I want to use all these somehow. So the biggest problem with that was trying to pick the take I liked the most out of many. And so it's really fun to play around with that kind of stuff, still make it relevant. That was something that, like I said before, like that morning we had the audio, like, okay, let's see if we can do this day and turn it around. Like I said before, it's factual, it's real audio. It's inherently funny, but still informative. I mentioned the green screen. The green screen is something that, again, carried over, but it allows for some creativity when we're trying to put you in the moment. And what's really nice about TikTok is that's a feature that's on the app, is that green screen effect. We use an actual green screen, as Carmela's displaying behind her. It's easier for us to edit to, and it's cleaner and crisper. But it's great that that isn't something that's inherent to TikTok that we can then use. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it feels like it's part of the app. And that's been something from day one, is that we want our TikToks to match what is happening on the app. And the app continues to evolve, and so do we. So that's why when we first started out, it was like 13-second TikToks, really just going with trends. It wasn't a lot of news TikToks. It was just kind of like, here's the newsroom, and here's this weird guy, Dave, with spam, and seeing how that went. And then as the pandemic happened, it became clear that TikTok was going to keep evolving. And now TikTok is like, they're pushing for videos that are over a minute. So we're pushing that as much as we can as well. It makes our jobs, sometimes the days are longer, as Carmela just pointed out with her example. But it's really great and very rewarding, because instantly you're getting feedback and you're getting people that are watching this and grateful that they, might have seen the news when otherwise they never would have seen that story. And that's it from this presentation. I will throw it back over to you, Alexa.
That was awesome. So informative. And it's so cool just to see how these TikTok videos materialize. Before we jump into some of the questions that we got from the Google form, I just want to kind of touch on some of the things that are happening in the chat right now. So there was a question for you, Carmela, when you were kind of sharing about your idea for that first video you showed. Were those internal messages, or were you sharing those kind of publicly to maybe generate ideas or hype around that video coming out the next day?
That is a great question. That would be awesome if I was just like sharing it to the newsroom for hype, like, everyone get ready. No, so we had, when I was getting that TikTok approved, I had 2 managers above me, Lauren and Libby, shout out to them. And so it was an internal message with our team. So it was me and them too. And it was an internal Slack message, just like Microsoft Teams. Just Slacking.
Gotcha. And there are a couple questions about managers. So which parts of the newsroom approve these TikToks, and what are your managers looking for when they are approving that text that's on screen?
So we have a really interesting setup in that there's like a social media section of the Washington Post that's really focused on Reels and Twitter and Threads and all that kind of stuff. We're embedded in the video team, which is a team of about 70 plus people, I think. And we're a team within that is now called Live Moments team, but it's basically about a dozen people. And that's the team that I was originally hired to. And then when we launched TikTok, we sort of built the TikTok team within that. So the reason I say all that is because the people that approve this are the managers of that team. Their names are Zach and Lauren. Either one of them can approve at any time. They can approve the script and then approve the final TikTok, but we don't post until we have clear approval from them. what makes that approval process generally faster is that these are all based on existing post articles. So a lot of times it might seem out of laziness, but sometimes intentionally we use the exact phrasing from an article because that was already edited by a different editor in a different section. So it's actually easier to kind of follow that because we already know that that's been published by the post. And so that makes that process slightly faster. But it is really important to get that quick approval, especially if we're doing something that's kind of on trend on TikTok, because you don't want to be the lame company that, is doing something 4 days late.
Totally. And it's really interesting to hear about what other roles are playing a part in this TikTok process that we're not seeing. You're not just going out there and posting anything willy-nilly. There's kind of, checks in place to make sure that it is kind of meeting those standards. So thank you so much for all of these questions in the chat. Because we have so many people watching, I want to remind folks to try to use that Q&A feature instead, just so we can kind of keep the questions separate. But let's kind of move on. So Dave, you literally wrote the book on making TikToks. You have a book, Make a TikTok Every Day, that includes 365 fun and creative prompts. And for a lot of people, it's coming up with the idea. That's the hard part. So do these TikTok ideas just kind of pop into your head? Do you have a running notes app? So let's start with Dave, and then Carmela, you so skillfully lip sync and find these trending audios. And then I want to hear from you how these ideas come to you.
Thank you. Yeah. When I was promoting the book, I always had it on hand, but I don't have it. What I do have is what someone sent me, which was a cover made custom for the book of, you guessed it, spam. But anyway, so yeah, actually I can kind of give you the answer within that book. When I first was trying to make that book, the idea was, hey, you should make a book about like how to make TikToks and like the production side, which Carmela just did a really good job of showing in that PowerPoint. But that was kind of my point. I was like, that book should be a long YouTube video. It shouldn't be like, it'd be really hard to put all that technical stuff within a book. I think it's much more fun and interesting to do a bunch of ideas. And it was like 365 ideas so that you could do one every day. And that was kind of the point, is that like every day you wake up and what can I do with this news story, or what can I do in the confines, especially during the pandemic, of my 1-bedroom apartment. And that to me is just like, I guess that's sort of the secret sauce, which is like, I like being somewhat contained. So like, even if we're at an event, like even if we're going to cover New Hampshire, for instance, or something that's happening on the road, like some political event, we're still kind of contained within that event. So what can we do within that to make a really fun TikTok that's going to be informative and interesting and still be relevant to the app? Yeah, I don't run out of ideas. I will say sometimes I make it, I'm like, nah, that wasn't as funny as I thought it was going to be. But then, of course, what happens on TikTok is the ones that you're not as excited about end up going crazy viral. And you're like, how did that happen? I didn't even think this would happen. Yeah, Carmela's agreed. I'll send it over to her now.
Yes, I definitely agree. I feel like a lot of part of what we do is like creative and artsy, and I feel like that's a very common thread of people like, I spent so much time on this and I put so much effort and like days and it doesn't do anything, and then the one where it's like one off, you're like, okay, I'll rock with it because I like to be successful, but this isn't what I wanted. But how do I come up with ideas? My approach is always like, how would I want to find out about a news story, and like how would I tell it to a friend? I went to Syracuse University and studied broadcast journalism and did the traditional like standing up there with a microphone and like using the news voice. And for me, that wasn't something I enjoyed listening to. That wasn't something I enjoyed doing. So I always try and come at it from a perspective of, if I were to tell the story to a friend and I were playing all the different characters, how would I be playing them in order to get that news story across? So whenever I read like a news article, that's how I approach it.
Interesting. So one question that I'm seeing quite a bit is, are there any sort of specific criteria or guidelines that you follow when you are selecting news topics to feature on TikTok? Because I imagine that not every story the post covers is kind of best suited for this format.
Yeah, that's one thing that's been really nice is, I mentioned earlier that like TikTok now asks, like they literally ask when you open the app to make videos that are longer than 60 seconds. What it used to be when we first started, it was, they specifically told me that people at TikTok, that they should be 12 to 19 seconds. That's what they had figured out that works best for their algorithm. And so with that, we were very confined to like, well, if we do any news stories, they have to be like basically one note things like the weather this weekend's going to be bad. Like it had to be something more simplified. Now we have a little bit more room where we can, if it's going to be a more complex one, we can make it a longer TikTok. We don't always do that. If it's more serious, like sometimes there's just a story, like, you know, when the war broke out in Ukraine, that's a good example where it's like, okay, we have to treat this fully seriously. We cannot do any jokes, obviously. And we kind of went with a specific approach of here's what's happening and let us know if there's any information you're seeing that you're confused about so we can explain it to you. And so a lot of people were tagging us in other videos that were appearing up on about Ukraine on TikTok. If anyone remembers at the time, there's a lot of people posting like video game footage and claiming it was in Ukraine. So we were sort of fact checking that kind of stuff. So there's no like limit to what we can cover, but it is something like what is within the confines of the day that we can do. And if it's a really important, serious story, then maybe I'm going to take 2 days to work on this and maybe, you know, really script it out. In some extreme scenarios, if we're really not sure, we actually send it to the author of that story to make sure that everything we've done for this script is going to perfectly match, you know, be fact checked, like double fact checked again by them, but also be the right tone.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I'm sure finding that balance of entertainment and information can be a tough, you know, line to draw. For everyone watching, Dave and I did a very similar webinar like this a few years ago. And Dave, you said something to the lines that you just said, like Washington Post wouldn't do a TikTok over 20 seconds. And now,
Yeah.
as you said, TikTok is kind of seemingly pushing for that longer format content. And so we got a question in advance is, you know, how do you guys navigate those changes in trends within the platform? And, you know, is there kind of a world where the Washington Post creates 10-minute long TikToks?
Let me talk Carmela up and then hand it off to her. Carmela's really good at finding the changes that are happening in real time. For instance, just the fact that we're on Shorts is because of her. Early last year, it was just a meeting, kind of like a Zoom call like this, where it's like, why don't we do that? We're like, okay. And then all of a sudden we had like, you know, 250,000 followers just by essentially, for the most part, reposting. I mean, we can talk about more of that if you want to. I know someone asked about that in the chat, but like essentially we're just like posting the same thing to Shorts as long as it's under 60 seconds because Shorts can't be longer. And so Carmela's really good at picking up on what new trends are happening. I'll throw it to you now, Carmela.
I appreciate you, Dave. And to Dave's credit, whenever I say like one-off ideas and stuff, I think one of the things that makes our team so effective is I can say an idea and Dave will just be like, yeah, that's great. Like, let's make it happen, and like helps make it happen. And it wouldn't be possible without that kind of synergy. So I would say to anyone like in the audience who's about to work on a newsroom or like work on a team or just in general, like that's such a good thing to look out for, like in a boss and in like a colleague, because we wouldn't be successful without that. And related to
Yes.
that, when it comes to doing content across platforms, those music TikToks slay on TikTok. And then they don't do as well on YouTube Shorts and on Instagram Reels. So I've adapted my approach to include more dialogue-based content, because then audience don't need to understand, like, why is this girl lip syncing? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why is it JoJo, but it's like politics, whatever. So definitely adapting to just where traffic is and what audiences are receptive to.
Yeah, kind of speaking of that strategy, Joe put in a question in the Q&A. So are you posting those premiere versions to YouTube Shorts, or are you exporting the TikTok version and then uploading it to that platform?
So it's a really good question, and it's something where I like right now, as of the last couple of weeks, we're kind of in the process of figuring out if we do it a different way. The person that was in the one group talk video on the right, also nervously laughing next to Carmela, that's Anna. She is in charge of a lot of that cross posting, and she does a really good job with that. Mostly, well, for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that her titles on YouTube Shorts are so good, and I am not a quote unquote child of YouTube. So like I don't like when she makes those titles, it's something that I would never have thought of, but they're really effective and they reach that audience in a different way that our TikTok audience does not. So she's really thinking about not just about how do we repost this, but also like what should those titles look like? How do we package it slightly different for YouTube while not taking away sort of the integrity of the original video? To answer the original question, usually it's just that file that Anna takes. She takes the TikTok watermark off of it and then reposts it to Shorts and Reels. Lately, we've been going, okay, let's export a clean version. So a version that doesn't have the watermark on it and maybe has the text boxes burnt in from Premiere Pro. And then she posts that one on Shorts and maybe on Reels as well. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I tend to prefer the latter now because I have this like sort of kind of tinfoil hat theory that Reels especially kind of suppresses videos that have a TikTok watermark on them. Totally not founded, by the way. I just think that happens. I don't know. I could be wrong. So I very much am into the idea of like, let's just make it a fresh, different video file that we can then repost to Reels.
Very interesting. So we have a few questions in the Q&A that I'm going to try to kind of consolidate into one question. But just about, does your team have discussions about this content being editorial versus news? There's a lot of questions on, is this kind of perceived as satire online? And how do you what are those kind of conversations like?
I think some of the, and Carmel, please answer this too. I think some of this is the satire and parody are somewhat baked in a little bit, because my initial job was a YouTube channel called Department of Satire, Washington Post Department of Satire, and then we renamed it Washington Post Shorts. That's where we post the shorts now on YouTube. And so my approach early on was kind of a comedic angle into these videos. It doesn't mean that they're all comedic, obviously, as we discussed, but I think sometimes that is the way in, especially on apps like TikTok, where you need to kind of, blend in a little bit for people to get their news. Otherwise, they're going to swipe right past it. More and more, there's room for kind of a little bit more serious tone. I think Joseph, who again started last week, is already bringing this, I wouldn't say more serious tone, but like more kind of stand-up professionalism. If you look at his Apple Vision Pro TikTok we posted today, it's a kind of a slightly different tone. It still feels part of our Washington Post universe, but it's kind of trying different things. So yeah, like to answer I know that there's a lot of things about the editorial part. Like within that approval process, we do go a lot back and forth of, hey, I don't think this thing that you're doing here would fly. I think you need to reshoot it. Like even if it's been things as small as like having a facial expression or just like a one-liner that we go, okay, we should cut that out or we should change that line. What Carmela and I do often, and I don't know if you have an example, Carmela, is like we'll make a TikTok and we'll shoot it two different ways. Like we might have a line that we're like, I don't know if Lauren will approve this, but I'm going to send that one to her first, and then I'll have the backup ready in case she says no. But there is an active discussion there.
Yeah, and then to add to that, whenever I'm still making a TikTok, I came in with the basis of what like the format that Dave laid down, so that's what I adapted to. But also at the end of the day, like I'm still a journalist, and that's my job first and foremost. The most important part of my job is telling the story in like a clear and concise way, and then adding like the bells and whistles and like the singing and whatever on top of it. And so that always goes through my mind as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Carmela, I want to stick with you because we can kind of see your TikTok backdrop, and you kind of gave us a preview of what it takes to create those TikToks. So the platform has made video editing and that style of creation far more accessible. You don't necessarily need a bunch of fancy editing software, which is cool. That said, watching the post content, it's very clear that there's that higher production quality there. I mean, you just kind of showing us how you're creating the videos. You're not doing that in app. So can you kind of tell us a little bit more about what kind of equipment it takes to create a Washington Post TikTok, and maybe kind of what your home office setup looks like as well?
Yeah, totally. Welcome to my apartment, guys. So this is my living room, and behind me is my green screen that I use at home. I use this like almost every single day. I also have a steamer. I steam her every single day as well to make sure she's nice and smooth. She's not steamed yet. We shoot almost all of our TikToks literally like on iPhones, and we shoot in 4K, in 30 frames per second. But we found that shooting on iPhones just is native to the platform, and it's super easy to do. I do use a little like lav microphone that I plug into my phone, and so I have my work phone and my personal phone, and I record the audio on my personal phone. And then once that's all done, I put it into Premiere and I'm ready to go. It's a very simple setup, but it helps our process be, again, streamlined. It doesn't have to be super fancy, bells and whistles using like, I have a Sony camera, but like using that makes the process take longer because now all of our file footages or all of our footage files are bigger. So using an iPhone is great.
That's awesome. You also, I don't think would be able to tell watching, since the quality is just so high and there's also so many things happening on screen. But I kind of want to now transition to talk more about how you both view the TikTok audience and also more of the journalism aspects of your job. So Dave, you talked about this a little at the top. So while the handle is at Washington Post, your name on TikTok is We Are a Newspaper. So can you tell us a little bit more about that decision? You kind of talked a little bit earlier how people maybe just didn't realize it was a news account.
Yes. So there's a lot of, I think something that I think is really important, and this kind of predates TikTok, is the idea that like this sort of universe building thing, which is like having inside jokes that a lot of people are aware of. Like I've always been very into this idea of an audience member, like a devoted audience member, knowing when the inside joke is happening on the sitcom or the show or the whatever, and feeling like they're part of it. It's like they have an open secret with the host or whatever. So there's a lot of little things like that, like the spam, but there's also like characters that reappear in different TikToks that people love to point out in the comments. That's great for us because it's sort of audience building and they feel like they are part of something. And it's great for just like building the lore where, you know, like it's just building, in some ways people would say brand building. I kind of stay away from that because we're journalists, we're not marketing people, but it is brand building in that way. And the We Are a Newspaper thing is really interesting because that's what I put as the bio in 2019 because of all the people saying things like, hey, I'm in Seattle, are you nearby? Like they didn't know that Washington Post was in DC. And then being like thinking my name was Washington, I was posting all this stuff. So I was like, okay, the subtitle or the bio was just going to say We Are a Newspaper. And that was what it was called, I think. I think it was called Subtitle. I don't know, something like that. And then TikTok at one point updated the app in like 2021 or something, where that became the thing that appears on screen. So suddenly everyone thought that we had changed our name to We Are a Newspaper when it had always been that, but it was much more front facing. And that's when this other inside joke started, where people in the comments still to this day will be like, they'll just ask, are you a newspaper? And then we reply, we are a newspaper. And it's kind of evolved where, like, you know, yesterday there was a video with about why dogs wag their tails. I don't know if this happened in the video, but for example, they'll cling onto something in the video like, are you a dog? And say, no, we are a newspaper. It's super dumb, but it's like people love it. They love to be creative. There's been some really funny versions of that. And it just kind of, again, builds this community. And I think that's also just like super, super important in this age of divisiveness, not to get too like, you know, my pedestal here, but I think it's important that one, people feel like they are part of this TikTok account, but also that they can trust us. And I think building trust also includes those little small inside jokes and this whole like community of We Are a Newspaper. So it's both kind of a silly throwaway joke and also I think kind of more meaningful on a different level.
Yeah, so you mentioned, you know, this kind of also being used as a marketing tool. Carmela, you also talked extensively about strategy. A lot of students are curious, what's the ultimate goal with this account? Is it to drive traffic to the Washington Post? Carmela, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the main goals is just to continue to build awareness in young people, and build their interest in the news. Because I think a lot of the time, especially as a kind of young person, I'm not watching the traditional news. And until college, I didn't really get into like reading newspapers or even like it being relevant to my life that much. And so if this is a way to get people in the habit of at least presenting them with news concepts and like basics elements of a story and getting them interested in, okay, well, I want to know more about that. Okay, so she sang and like danced to JoJo, but like, what does this mean for me? And like, how does this actually impact me? And I think our account and piquing that interest is super important because then when people want to know more about the stories, they can go to the Washington Post because that's where all of our content is based from.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dave.
Just to add that really quickly, one thing that we try to do a lot of, and I think we've been pretty consistent over the last 5 years, is occasionally including other reporters that are willing to be on camera. Sometimes it takes a little convincing, sometimes it doesn't. And by showing those people, it's also like, you know, it's the same idea of like any reporter showing up on Fox News or MSNBC. It's like, oh, that's what that reporter looks like. Now I can put a face to this, you know, what the articles that I read. And so we're doing that a little bit with TikTok, but I think really like lean into that trust building part. We do a survey, or rather we've done it every year for the last 2 years. And every time we do this survey, one of the questions is from our audience, do you trust the post more or less after following the TikTok account? And you do get like a little bit of neutral, but overwhelmingly all the answers, I mean, like, I think it was like something between 70 and 80% were people that said they trust us more after following the TikTok account. So I think there's something very significant happening there, especially with our demographic, which again is averages around 25, 26, including Gen Z millennials. And I think that, you know, however you look at it, like a decade from now, if someone is thinking, hey, I want to learn more about this thing I saw in the news, maybe in the back of their head, they're going, I should go to the Washington Post, whether it's TikTok or some other version of us that exists then, because of sort of the groundwork that we're laying now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Authenticity is such a major part for building trust. So sticking with that, Kenvin, a ninth grader from Hawaii, submitted a question to our Google form. And they're curious, how can we use social media as a news source? So Carmela, I'd love to kind of start with you. What do you think credibility looks like on TikTok or social media in general?
I think it comes a lot from, quite honestly, like transparency on where those stories are coming from. I think on TikTok, it's really easy at the beginning when you're watching a video and the first couple of seconds are dramatic and they hook you in. But if someone's saying a super dramatic statement, my thought is always, well, where's that coming from? What's the intention behind this content? And so whenever I see news on TikTok, I always go to the account page and say, okay, who is this person in the first place? Where are they pulling their sources from? Are they even a real? I'll go like full, because I like work in news, I think I go full, like not stalker, but full investigator of where is this person coming from? And then once I know like who they actually are and where their sources from, then I'll decide whether or not I want to keep watching their content. I'm sure quite a few of you in the audience might be able to relate to this, but when like family members will send you a video and they'll be like, oh, I can't believe this is happening. And then you watch the video and it's like a dramatic person like in red lighting and it's really intense. And you look and they don't have any sources of their content. So I'm just skeptical of whatever I see. And then once I know that it's coming from a reliable source, whether it's like the Washington Post or like a big news organization or someone who continually like vets their sources and shows you their sources, then I'll watch it there.
Those are all great news and media literacy tips. Especially on TikTok, I've noticed just adding spooky sounding music to the background of anything. Just like, oh, there's spooky sounding music. I should be
crazy.
Scary or weary of this.
It drives me nuts. To Carmela's point, like that's the one thing about this job. It's like it's made me. I was always kind of skeptical, but now I'm like everything I see, I'm like, oh, the music. No, I don't trust this because the music, and I almost have to like, you have to work even harder for our trust because we're like, I know exactly what sound effects you're using. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. It's like you want to be skeptical, but you don't want to be cynical about all news and information. So we got a couple of questions in our Google form about what happens if there is backlash over one of your videos. So Peter, an eighth grader in Illinois, wants to know, what do you do if people think a TikTok is wrong or if it's too silly about a serious topic? Do you ever remove videos? And as a follow-up to that, what does issuing corrections look like on TikTok? There's been a bunch of comments in chat about there not really being any citations that you can use in TikTok. So Dave, let's start with you and then go to Carmela.
Yeah, I'll kind of go backwards. As far as citations, certainly when it makes sense, we like for photos or videos, obviously they're like credited for anything like that. But also in the description, we put as much as the article as possible. Something that's been great the last couple of years is finally TikTok allowed descriptions to be like not, there's like 100-character limit before or something like that. Now you can put like a really decent chunk of the article, which includes sources and everything like that people might need to dig deeper. And then of course we're in the comment section too if people have follow-up questions where we can kind of give more answers there. As far as the sort of reposting, or if we've done it maybe 2 or 3 times. It doesn't happen very often at all, which I'm super proud of. And if we've ever deleted and reposted, it's very like, it's the first thing you see in the description. This is a repost and explaining why we reposted it and what we got wrong. And it's annoying. It sucks. But sometimes those couple of times we've had to do it, I really wish I could remember one of them right now. I don't know if Carmela can. I'm not like, I promise I'm not having like an intentional amnesia thing, but it wasn't like a big deal, but it was like, oh, that literally is a number or something that we just by accident got wrong. So we just repost it when that happens. But I think we handle it pretty well, and it's the same as you would with an article online. You know, with the Post or the Times, anyone would put there, then they would issue correction at the bottom at the top explaining why they had to issue a correction.
Yeah, I think the couple of times that happened, I remember when I started that particularly was happening to me because when I was typing out all of those text bubbles, I would like put like I'd spell a word wrong or I'd like put a wrong number or something. And of course now that's incorrect. And unlike with a news article, you can't just go in and like fix the number. You have to go in and like re-edit the whole thing. Um and so that's what I would do. And I amended that by just doing voice to text, to be quite honest. And so now everything is spelled right because I'm not typing it in. But I think when covering more serious issues and things, I always, again, go back to if the story were about me, how would I want someone to be talking about it? If this were happening to someone in my family, or if this were happening to like my daughter, or literally anyone, how would I want the story to be portrayed? And so I think that's an internal gauge that I have when it comes to especially covering serious stories like that and determining if we go too far or not.
Interesting. So this is a question that we got quite a few times in the Google form, and I'm also seeing it in the Q&A. So the Washington Post, as a newsroom, has covered TikTok, the app, pretty extensively. You've reported on TikTok bans. You've reported on concerns about the app being a national security threat. You've also covered these issues on your TikTok account itself. So I think people are curious, just generally, how does the Washington Post respond to concerns about TikTok's connection to China? Can you give us any sort of insight into what those newsroom conversations were like?
Yeah. So, you know, just like any other data privacy concerns on any platform, we treat it the same way. So, like, for instance, when the Cambridge Analytica, that whole situation with Facebook several years ago, the Post reported about that and posted those articles on Facebook. So, like, if it's happening, it's not as if we're going, oh, we're not going to post about it on the platform we're talking about. We're very unafraid of that. And I will say every time we've posted critically about TikTok on the app, I haven't noticed clear suppression. It's obviously very hard to tell the difference. We specifically did a TikTok about suppression on TikTok and tried to get suppressed, and then the opposite happened. You could have several theories as to why that happened, but literally we got like over 1 million views in a day on our TikTok trying to get suppressed. So we take it very seriously. What I've always said to people is, like, if any of these concerns, if there's any actual, like, you know, for instance, the government, every time this sort of gets brought up about banning TikTok, what happens is they get stopped at the part with the evidence. They don't really have any clear evidence of your data being stolen by China. If it got to that point, then that'd be a different conversation and be like, should we be on this app? And what I've always said is that, you know, TikTok, kind of like how Thor says about Asgard, it's a people, not a place. Like, those people are going to go somewhere regardless. So if we had to get off TikTok, if it got banned in the country, whatever, we're already on Shorts and Reels. Like, we already have this audience that will go with us. It's not as if they'll just stop looking at their phones or like watching video on their phones. They'll just find another place to watch it. So we're always aware of that. We're always tracking it. And I love making TikToks about it. I think it's really important. And I think a lot of people on TikTok are really grateful when we post about those privacy concerns.
I know we are starting to run out of time. So I want to do kind of a tip closer. When we're just casually scrolling online, how can we be thinking like a Washington Post journalist or a Washington Post TikToker? Carmela, let's start with you.
Just in general, like just reading news articles.
Sure, yeah.
Again, I would say I always have skepticism of what I'm reading and where that's coming from until I research, okay, where is this company? Who owns the company? Who's publishing on the company? What's the intention of what I'm consuming? I love to take images that I see on Twitter and on the internet and like cross search them and be like, was this published somewhere else? So I just approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. And then once I figure out like where that organization is coming from, then I know, okay, great, that's a trusted source that can be like in my circle of trust of news organizations that I look to.
Dave?
Alexa, as an ambassador of MediaWise, a company we both know and love, I've learned many skills. One of which, there's two that I really do think about consciously all the time. One is, like, if you read something, most likely you probably should like look look at that story elsewhere, like try to find another source talking about that story and just, cross-check that and see if it lines up with that, especially, and that's the other part of this, if you have an emotional reaction to it. I think like so much of this, I don't want to say can be solved, but can be sort of tamed by everyone checking in with their emotional reaction to any news. And that includes our TikToks. Like if you watch one of our TikToks, you're like, oh my God, this news makes me feel crazy or mad or whatever, like you should cross-check it. And, because we've done our work right, you'll find that we were factually correct. But it's really important, even if it's something that is totally, completely true, that you are making sure that you have all the facts and understand it completely. Because, so much of these sort of algorithms on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter, everywhere, thrive off of that emotional reaction, whether it's anger or happiness or whatever. So you really have to be careful with that, because there's a lot of people who are motivated to post that way and aren't necessarily motivated to be factually correct.
Totally. Jill in the chat, a teacher librarian, says, I am snapping my fingers for these tips. I want to just share a handout if you want to kind of continue these conversations with students in the classroom. The News Literacy Project, we created an activity that you can do, or essentially you can storyboard a TikTok like the Washington Post. So essentially you're gonna be searching for a piece of local news, something that interests you that you would wanna maybe create a TikTok around. So in that left field, and also we're gonna drop a link to this Google form in the chat, but in the left field, this is where you're gonna be writing the script, anything that you're gonna be saying on camera, or if you're lip syncing, what the audio is you're lip syncing to. In that middle category, it's all of the production elements that are happening on screen. If you're using the green screen to show an article, make sure you're also kind of hyperlinking that article as well. Try to be descriptive if you're using any of those TikTok effects. And then on the right column, you can add any sort of additional supplemental text or emoji. So Dave or Carmela, any final tips on how students can be scripting like a Washington Post TikToker?
Well, I have a sort of lateral tip, which is Carmela mentioned earlier, good lighting is important. Carmela is a really good example of good lighting right now. I'm an example of the opposite, terrible lighting. Don't have an overhead light, don't have anything behind you. So lighting is important in those TikToks too. But as far as scripting, I think it has to be, you could have a TikTok be 10 seconds, it could be 60 seconds. I think the important thing though is that there's a rhythm to it. There's always something happening. And that's something that only gets better with time. That's true for, as for us editing on our computers a lot, but just making a TikTok, you have to feel like there's almost a rhythm to it. I know that sounds crazy, but once I say this now, you'll start to see TikToks and go, oh, this is really interesting because it's keeping my attention. And I think that's really important. Carmela, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say based off of that, keep your script nice and concise. I think when you're writing, it's really easy to write a really long sentence that'll just go on and it has a bunch of information in it, and you're like, this is all so important. But when you're listening to that, and even when you're like reviewing your own video, it's really hard to understand what you're trying to say. Keep your video and your sentences nice and short and concise, and you can still include those ideas, but just make sure that they're separate, and that way you don't run out of breath when you're saying those sentences as well, because I've done that a lot. Growth.
Those are all fantastic tips. And so for educators, if you found this program meaningful for your students, I just want to remind you that there are 100 other plus journalists that are willing to do this sort of newsroom to classroom visit with your students. This is a perk that is exclusively available through our Checkology account. And we've had journalists come and visit classrooms both in person and virtually. So I just want to remind you that that resource is there. And to Dave and Carmela, thank you again so much for sharing your expertise and your time. This has been so awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
for
everyone in
having
the
us.
chat is also
Thank you.
saying thank you.
Thank you to everyone in the
Thank you
chat.
all.
The questions were really great. I expected that, but they were like, there's nothing better than these questions. It's actually really good feedback too within the questions. So I really appreciate everyone's questions. And Alexa, thank you so much for moderating all this. It's really great.
Of course. All right. Well, I'm excited to see today's Washington Post TikToks, and I hope everyone else has a great rest of your day. Happy National News Literacy Week.